the original idea I had behind doing a bunch of ultrasound measures of fingers is just kind of challenging or thinking about the idea of like the use of a 20 mil edge. Because if all we do is use a 20 mil edge and we overload it, that's not an edge that supports the DIP joint. So in order to like go really heavy, we have to put a decent amount of stress at the DIP joint because it's not covered. So my original idea was like, well, how many people's fingers are that much less than 20 millimeters to show that it does support the edge, and not that many people. So a 20 mil edge doesn't really cover that many people's DIP joints. If you're someone that falls into the camp of my fingers get sore if I use a 20 mil edge, regardless of what I want to do with my finger training, I've tried it for years and I keep getting hurt, just don't use a 20 mil edge, use a 30 millimeter edge. Because the original, when I started looking into this maybe 5-6 years ago, that was like the thing to do. Everyone used a 20 mil edge to do max hangs. And I would talk to so many people that were doing that had sore fingers all the time. And, and that doesn't mean they can't strength train their fingers. It just means that they need to be educated more about, don't be too invested or strict with this is the edge to use, because that's definitely not the case when it comes to the physiology. So it's just understanding more variation and then helping people understand how they can apply it.
Tyler Nelson, Dr. Tyler Nelson, welcome to the Testpiece podcast, man.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I had to get that doctor in there because I told you you're the first doctor I've had on the podcast. Although you told me don't make a big deal out of it, but I thought it was cool. So just throwing it in there, man.
I wasn't sure if you were actually literally going to clap, so I'm glad we got the clap in too. I was like, is that like a audio clap or you're literally going to clap?
It was applause for you to step on stage. It's just for editing, man. I needed to know right when we started, and that was it. Tyler,
Cool.
We're started. We're doing it. Tyler, you're the founder of Camp 4 Human Performance based in Salt Lake City. I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with you and your work, but just for those that aren't, your company provides coaching, training plans, rehab consultations, testing, courses, certifications. There's a ton more. And you've worked with some of the top athletes in our sport, like Allison Vest, Nathaniel Coleman, Alex Johnson, probably a bunch of other ones, but they've all been on the podcast before. So I just wanted to call them out. And in fact, it was really my chat with Allison Vest that got the ball rolling on us being here today. So thank you, Allison. She is famous for having insanely strong fingers, which you've tested and done some videos with her. And I guess for me, Tyler, I'm really interested in finger strength. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's my climbing. So yeah, thanks for coming on today. I just am psyched to dive really, really deep into strength training for the fingers and hands.
Yeah, thanks. I think most climbers are enthusiastic about discussing finger training, because it's obviously a limiter for a lot of individuals. And from my standpoint, it's the most injured body part in a climber. And so the majority of my day I spend talking to athletes with injured fingers. And so it always comes down to thinking about ways that we can potentially reduce the total load to the fingers, both with climbing and training and lifting, so athletes can continue to progress in their sport and also keep their injury risk low. So it's hard to talk about climbing without addressing finger things, although certainly finger strength, in my opinion, now is emphasized too much, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that. So yeah, happy to chat.
Yeah, Tyler, in my little outline where I had some maybe miscellaneous questions for you, one of my questions was, as a longtime climber, all of us who are longtime climbers, are we doomed to have achy and arthritic fingers into our old age? And you just responded with yes. And you just broke my heart there, dude. You broke my heart.
It was great to just be blunt and direct there. It really comes down to just thinking about the size of the joint and thinking about the amount of stress we put on the fingers. And so what that does not mean is, it does not mean that everyone's going to not be able to use their hands when they're older and they're going to suffer chronic pain complaints and reduce their quality of life is not what that means. What it does mean though is, are we going to have some form of arthritic change to the cartilage and the joint and the bone and the ligaments? The answer is yes, because if athletes push themselves like I do and you do and all my clients do, like we can't really expect those things to not create, morphologic change over time. And that's pretty normal. And that does not mean though, however, that the athlete has to be, have a lot of pain and, suffer in that context. But the actual arthritic change, for sure, it's really pretty unavoidable.
Okay, that's a bummer. But what I heard from all that is I can have these changes, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be a lot of pain involved. And so I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed and keep doing what I'm doing. And actually, I want to revisit this when we talk later about ergonomic type of edges, because it seems like perhaps that's part of this equation for training and maybe, yeah, maybe keeping your fingers, I don't know what the word would be, more pain free as you get older. I'm just putting words in your mouth, but is that, are those connected at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the structural changes that happen for the most part are considered protective. A joint responds to mechanical load by making the cartilage inside the joint thicker and more resilient, making the ligamentous structures on the sides thicker and more resilient. But in order to do that, we have to injure the tissue, micro strains to the tissue to have it come back stronger. And so changes in cross sectional area to ligaments and tendons as a response of mechanical load is a stress response. But if we do it at a pace where we recover well between sessions and between training cycles, that should be an adaptive, protective thing, right? It's really when we just do too much stuff and we don't pay attention to the recovery and we don't prioritize that. Painful fingers are a problem, and painful fingers are things you want to address and see a healthcare provider for and manage your program. But structural changes to joints, like I don't know any climbers that have been climbing for a long time and hard that don't have them. It's just not reasonable to think that we wouldn't.
Yeah, it might sounds like it might be a bad sign if you don't have any structural changes. Perhaps you're not under enough load to cause adaptations, and that's part of the adaptation. And it makes me wonder if there's any research done, or if you know anything about people who start young. Like I started at maybe 8 years old, and what does it do, if anything, different when people start at a really young age to their structures?
Dr. Schoffel, the German surgeon who was kind of like the one of the leaders in the world of research in finger injuries and climbing adaptations. They have quite a few numbers on youth athletes because they work with the whole German team, showing that those athletes absolutely have wider bases of their like middle phalanx. So the bones actually change in their size. The volar plates, which are the extension of the joint capsule on the flexor side of the finger where the pulleys attach, are bigger and stronger, and their cross-sectional area to their tendons is larger as well. And so once an athlete, like I didn't start climbing till I was in college, till I was maybe 20, 21. And so my cross-sectional area, my tissues are not going to change much in that time frame, except for getting micro strains that my body adapts to. But youth kids that climb, they absolutely will have greater load capacity because their tissues will adapt to be larger. And so their cross sectional area will increase because of it literally is collagen fibrils, where mine is more like a stress response. So, yeah, there is evidence to support that athletes grow up doing this will have changes to their fingers that will, help them like climb harder grades. And that's one of the reasons why youth athletes now are just like totally dominating previous bests in the sport, which is really cool.
Gosh, that's crazy that when you start young, literally your whole entire like bones, all that stuff gets bigger. I don't know. It's just, I guess it's obvious, but it's just wild to think that my fingers probably look different than they would have in an alternate universe where I hadn't been a climber. And it's something that I've observed anecdotally, even in myself to some extent, is that people who climbed in their youth all the way, through until their adulthood seem to suffer from less finger injuries. And I guess I kind of, I hunch that it was just structural changes, but is is it also just that consistent loading a little bit more over time? Is it basically like slow strength training is why young kids or adults who climbed through their youth seem to suffer from less acute injuries later in life?
Yeah, I would think so. I think the athletes that I've tested that are, let's say, beyond youth, or even some youth athletes, but some that are beyond youth, have really strong fingers. And if you ask them about their training history, they have no intentional finger strength training, like training. They just don't train their fingers aside from just climbing. So that's a really good example of just slowly working through grades. The holds get smaller, they get further apart, and that is slow progressive overload to the fingers, to the tendons, the ligaments, the joint capsules, etc. That's part of it. I think the other part of it is they have enough exposure to climbing. They're not as anxious to try and push numbers too fast, right? They already are very skilled and they already know what it's like to make progress year to year and month to month. And so maybe people that don't have that big training history try and shortcut it and want to jump grades too fast. And so I think there's probably a bit of that as well. They're a bit more tempered with how much they actually do.
Hmm. Have you noticed that kids seem to prefer the three finger drag grip or basically open hand, but it really seems like kids seem to favor three finger drag? I don't know if you, this is like, this may be just in my circle, but we call it like the comp kid drag. Do you have any idea why kids might prefer that grip over full crimp?
It's probably ergonomic thing, especially females. It's hard to get the pinky on, with the pinky being short. And so I think that in conjunction with athletes maybe being taught at a young age that fingerboarding is dangerous, that full crimping is dangerous, they tend to do the drag for that reason, but also so they can reach a little bit more. So it kind of has a good function, but it also has, a bit more of a, almost they are scared to not crimp on their fingers too. So it really depends. I talk to a lot of climbers that will get injured that tend to full crimp everything, but I also talk to a lot of climbers that will get different kinds of injuries that three finger drag everything. And so one thing that's confusing for climbers to maybe understand, unless they're directly told, that there's not like a good or bad, risky or not risky grip position. It really is relative to the volume, but also the individual's kind of like mechanics of their own hand.
Yeah, I love that you point that out. And it's something that I was raised with, was that full crimping was bad and you only had, I don't know, you only had so many full crimps in your life that you can do or something like that. And so you should use them judiciously. So I love that. It always kind of struck me as being ridiculous because if the body can do something, like do a movement, that it's somehow inherently something we can do. So it shouldn't be inherently bad because if why would we be built to full crimp? Why would we even have that option if it wasn't something that was possible for our physiology to make use of? So that's just a perfect transition into doing our main topic, which is really just strength training of the fingers and hands for climbers. And you kind of hinted on this where you talked about kids who slowly built up their tolerance and didn't just shove in all of their hard climbing as fast as they could and jump the grades really early on in their climbing career. And it just, it's really interesting to me, your approach to strength training the hands in general and why we should strength train our hands. So why should someone fingerboard? Is it for everyone? Is it only for adults? Is it only for kids? Who's it for?
So I think if we consider finger strength training as just strength training in general for how other athletes would use it for their sport, and if we look at the what the science tells us about, why do people strength train in the first place? What are the benefits of strength training? The first one is that it has some sort of protective benefit to athletes. And so a lot of the data there comes from the lower extremity, but essentially the science shows that exposure of primary joints and muscle groups to a stimulus that's greater than a sport has some protective benefit, and that's from loading the tendons and loading the muscle and the fascia between the muscles. And there's a protective benefit there just by allowing the athlete to tolerate more practice. And so that's just like regular strength training in the warm up stuff. That's one of the reasons. The other reason that most people, all people really should strength train to some degree is that it allows like tissue quality changes that will allow them to practice a little bit harder for a little bit longer. And so it gets maybe confusing for people to think that a certain objective increase in strength will equate to an objective increase in climbing or sports performance, but that's not what the rest of the world would say is the function of strength training. The function is to allow you to still practice your sport, but without the practice of the sport, I wouldn't expect the performance to go up in the sport either.
Dude, Tyler, this was really huge when I heard you say this because it just kind of always seemed to me that you hang board to get stronger fingers. I'm just going to do the microcosm of fingers for us. And that was what it was all about. And that it was just like, okay, if you can up your numbers on here, then you can crimp harder on your project. But what I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's that we should all be strength training, regardless of our level, to reduce injury and to allow us to climb more. And that the gains in climbing comes from those benefits, not from it. That's wrong to connect your strength training directly with performance. And that intermediate step, or maybe it's not a step, it's just, it gets glossed over, and that the benefits are really there. And I just, it sounds obvious to me now that you say it, but I just want to dive in more to that because I think people just skip that understanding and go straight to like, I'm going to crimp harder on this 6 mil so I can crimp harder on the 6 mil on my project. And so, yeah, let's unpack that middle step a bit more.
Yeah, maybe the flaw with the logic there is the assumption that climbing on a harder grade requires you to apply more force to the hold, which we don't really have good evidence to support that we used that much force on the climbing wall. And measuring RFD and like impulse on climbing holds during climbing movements is something that we don't have a lot of research on, but the research we do have shows that it's around 60% body weight, which is kind of a high number in the research as to how much force you would apply, and that's not on a small hold either. And so the mistake that we make there is we assume that if we can increase the force that we can tolerate on a board, that means we will be able to grab onto a small hold and apply more force. But that kind of forgets that the real way we can use a hold is really based on our body position. So finger strength training is more a function of someone's flexibility and someone's technical skills and someone better putting load through their feet than it is about applying more force on a climbing hold. And so one of the things that, like, I just put out a kind of a story question last night on my Instagram account thinking about this. And my hypothesis was, because I'm the example of someone that can apply a lot of force on my fingers based on my mechanics, but I'm very stiff. I can't get into good positions on holds because of my hips. And so I know people that can produce way less force than me and they can climb way harder than me. And so like it really is not that like we need to focus so much about applying more force, because climbing and holding onto holds is so much more complex than that. But it's not really about just applying more force. Absolutely.
I thought I read something about this. This is total bro science here. I'm pulling out of nowhere. I remember reading something about if you gave someone a hold that was, I don't know, bumpy, not a nice flat edge, if you let them grip it multiple times, that they were able to produce more and more force on it very quickly because it was coordination and neurological changes. You know, I guess the reason why I thought of it here is because there's something about being able to apply force to the wall, or as little force as possible, really, uh, in the sense of trying to line yourself up with good position, that is really important for climbing. And just before we go down that tangent, am I onto something, or am I remembering that incorrectly? Where when holds are shaped strangely, that we have a lot of strength, quote unquote, strength gains. That's just from us understanding the coordination of how to apply our force to it.
Yes. And so when we look at the non climbing or definitely non climbing strength training research, we see that the adaptations to exercise are the things that are specific. So if you're doing like a deadlifting movement, you have to get coordinated at the deadlift before you can actually increase your recruitment levels and increase your literal strength. So the same thing with a climbing wall. If I only strength train my fingers on, let's say, a 20 mil edge, but I'm not actually getting the practice of applying that on the climbing wall, I shouldn't really expect the force produced and learned on a 20 mil to translate to a smaller edge that's on a wall at 30 degrees or 60 degrees or vertical. And so there's no doubt that the application of force on a wall is a function of learning the coordination on the wall, which people that are really good with their lower extremity, they use less force on the holds, but they're really coordinated at grabbing onto them. And if we look at like science in other contexts, if we did like a functional MRI of someone, every time you do it, it's a little bit different. And so it's never like the exact same neural pathway to grab onto even like a flat edge. And so what people don't want to hear is, oh, I'm just going to get really good with my legs and I don't have to apply much force on my fingers. Therefore, finger strength training isn't necessary. That's not true, because if I can increase someone's strength safely, I just give them a whole lot more access to muscle fibers that they could use in the context of climbing practice.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Um, the other thing that those unlevel holds, not ergonomic, but weird, bumpy unlevel holds like you often encounter outdoors, that makes me think of in relation to strength training is that when you have these weird shaped holds, you often apply strangely large amount of force to specific fingers. You know how when you just get like that
Mm-hmm.
tweaky hold where it seems like it all settles on maybe your ring finger. And so this goes back to the hangboarding exposure, allowing you to experience maximal strain on specific fingers in a controlled manner, so that when you encounter those strange holds, you're less likely to hurt yourself. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, and especially with the loads that people use, even if people are hanging with, 1.5 times their body weight, on a fingerboard, the science that I've seen doesn't really show that we commonly, if ever, use that much with one arm at a time on the climbing wall. So the hope there is to like also educate people that seeking more and more load, greater numbers on the fingerboard at some point, and the science would, in the climbing science would agree with this, at some point it's risky and it's not providing an additional benefit to the athlete. It's just them, kind of doing it because it's kind of built into the fabric of how climbers train. There's a bit of ego behind it, whatnot, but like there's definitely reasons to stop and pause and be like, I'm not sure that we really need to do that much training, because the consequences are people just get joint related injuries at a higher degree just based on the mechanical load.
Do you have any insight into when when people's fingers are strong enough? That's like the most ridiculous question to ask, because every person is different. Every maybe person's grade is different. But is there any, like, if you have an athlete walk into the door, do you ever tell them, hey, like maybe keep on strength training in the sense of giving yourself exposure to your tissues exposure so you can maintain whatever adaptations you have, but how do you know when your fingers are strong enough?
I think there's most professional athletes probably have that level of strength already. People that are climbing at the highest grades of our sport probably should still get small amounts of exposure on their hands as a protective response, but not because it should increase their performance. So it happens quite often. I would say myself, I'm someone that does not need to do additional finger strength training for the sake of making me be able to produce more force, because I've tracked my numbers over lots of years and they've always been high, but they haven't really changed that much. And so the other interesting thing about what the science tells us about strength changes and protective benefits of those changes is, even if athletes don't get objectively stronger, they still get the protective benefit of the strength training because of the exposure. And so something that I like to teach my clients is, it's easy for people to get frustrated when they plateau with something and they feel like they need a new stimulus, making the assumption that they're going to continue to progress forever. And that's just not practical. So, having people understand that the goal is to strength training as safely as you can, practice way more and focus on the practice of climbing in general, but maybe some intentional practice for the hands. And doing that all the time makes really good sense, and it should be sustainable for athletes.
So the fingers, when we're talking about finger strength, it's often easy to just think about maybe full crimps, or maybe I don't know, just like those three basic grip types: the full crimp, the half crimp, and open hand. But when we're thinking about this idea where perhaps professional athletes' hands or fingers are strong enough, what does that mean when it comes to these having a myriad of grip types? There's pinches, there's, I don't know, slopers. I mean, like I know all the musculature is the same in the hand, but all these grip types feel different, and sometimes there's big discrepancies. You know, do you just test, say, like the half crimp on someone and say, hey, because your half crimp exerts X amount of force, we don't even need to look at your full crimp? Or do you have to consider each grip type in isolation?
I don't do much like open-handed grip testing, or nor would I do much full crimp grip testing. Like I certainly would prioritize half crimp testing, as well as like the Talon grip, like a something where you're squeezing with the whole hand grip testing. I think the positional or the grip type variation, I think that's more of like a technical thing. It's like a technical, tactical climbing thing. There's some points where using the three finger drag makes sense. You get a little bit more reach. You can be a little bit more passive. Other times when the holds get small, you have to get better leverage on the hold. So you got to hyperflex the PIP and extend the DIP. I think trying to focus too much on the force in a particular grip type kind of misses the point of why we're strength training in the first place. And in terms of full crimp versus a half crimp, athletes aren't going to produce more force on a full crimp than a half crimp. And so if the goal of the strength training is really just to give them more recruitment or a stimulus that's going to promote stiffness to the connective tissues, using the bigger edge at a higher intensity makes sense, and then exposing them to the positional stress on the wall where they're still doing the half crimp, the full crimp stuff. So that doesn't mean that I don't ever train that or think that it matters, because it definitely does. But I don't see a huge value in like measuring or comparing the difference between the two, because there's other variables that are into consideration.
I see. I see. So when you're just talking about strength, just your ability to exert force through that physiology, it doesn't matter so much what the grip type is. But then if you want to maintain those other types of tissues that get stressed in different grip types, like say the full crimp, which is kind of, I mean, it's a weird mobility thing, right? It puts you into a different position. It's not about strength training there. It's about still exposing your tissues to the different shapes they may make, as well as probably coordination must be part of that as well.
Yeah, one of the subtle differences between the half and the full crimp is the hyperextension of the DIP joint. So when we hyperextend the DIP joint, we definitely stretch the FDP tendon, so it's a little bit longer of a distance between the center of rotation. So we do have to apply a little bit of force on that particular muscle. Whereas we're in like kind of an open half crimp position where not 90 degrees, but maybe 110 in like a curling kind of fashion. That is mostly a FDS, kind of stress. And so you will get slightly different numbers and different intentions with like using different positions for testing. But again, I think as long as we're getting some number on a repeatable position that's safe for the athlete, that we can use for training, and they can get the exposure to the more stressful positions in other ways, like to me, that is a more sustainable approach than assuming that everyone has to measure their full crimp, everyone has to measure their half crimp, and everyone has to measure an open-handed position, which is the least muscular of all the open position.
It totally makes sense. On the idea of full crimping and morphology as well, what some people can hyperextend quite a bit more at the dip joint, which is kind of the one closest to your fingertip. Uh, how does that change one's ability to exert force on the hold? It basically, is it better to be really hyperextended? Should we work towards that? Is it not matter? Just how do you think about the hyperextension, the dip joint applying to our ability to put force onto holds?
I don't know that there's a whole lot people can do to change how much mobility they have there. I don't know that I would ever promote the idea of someone intentionally trying to get hypermobile at their DIP joint. Like, I'm a good example of someone that has very stiff joints. And so I don't have a lot of extensibility on my middle three fingers, my index, middle, and ring finger there, but my pinky will hyperextend. But I'm not particularly a boss on really small holds, where I have a friend that I climb with often that's tall and slender and has really extensible DIP joints, and he's a boss on small holds. And so the ability to extend the joint allows you to pull your body close to the wall. So it allows you to hang on the hold a little bit better in some ways than someone that can't get in that position. And so there's all sorts of like weird grip options that people will use to try and optimize their leverage, like curling the fingers instead of extending the fingers. But I think there's a lot of unchangeable factors there in terms of people's collagen that, I think it's really hard to, make meaningful changes for people there, other than just like having them practice and, practice the positions and their body positions and use the best positions that they can.
Bummer. I wish I could hyperextend more. And I will say that just spending some time in full crimp mode has given me just, I don't know if I'm more mobile, but I'm more comfortable there. So I feel like I can apply more of my strength through there, and
Definitely more
probably,
comfortable.
yeah. And it's also probably makes it safer when I do full crimp by spending some time there. And uh, I will point out something I think we've talked about before, where just because someone can hyperextend, like your friend who can hyperextend so well on really small crimps and own them, I'm sure that that also leads to some shortcomings in other abilities that he has, where having stiff joints is maybe not the best thing in that circumstance, but I know that you have seriously strong fingers. And so is there some kind of balancing act there where like being hypermobile is great in that example and not so great in others?
Yeah, usually people that have a little bit more stiffness will have a little bit more rate of force. So my power should be a little bit greater than his, simply because I don't lose energy, let's say, by the joint stretching before my joint gets stiff and I apply force from my muscle. So there's that component as well. And it really just depends on the type of hold. Like a 10 mil to a 10 mil up, my fingers are really strong and quite capable. But like on 8 mil holds, they don't, it's hard to get on top of those holds. And so one thing that you mentioned, like you can, and I do this a lot with my clients that need to use small holds, which is another really important thing to bring up is, everyone does not need to train on really small holds and train to full crimp. If athletes have a need to do that, if they climb at Smith Rock, if they climb at Joe's Valley, if they climb at, Bishop, places that require you to grab small holds, then they absolutely need that stimulus. But if there are athletes that don't climb on those small of holds, then you don't need to do that. Like, you can just really like give yourself a breath of fresh air and not stress having to full crimp small holds, because the adaptation that we get there, we're talking about, is there's a lot of coordination adaptation, but then there's also a tissue stress relaxation adaptation, which will be you getting more comfortable in that position. But there's always risks with the things that we do. And so if we're not used to doing that regularly and we ramp up the amount of it we do, hopefully for a good reason, but sometimes not, that can be considered risky.
I'm kind of in the same boat there as you, where you give me a 10 mil and up, I feel quite strong. And then as we start getting 8 mil or 6 mil, I really struggle, but I do need to climb on small crimps. Although, to circle back to what you were saying earlier, it's like, well, Josh, maybe put more weight on your feet, right? Like maybe you're not going to get massive gains in your full crimp. Like maybe you can get more of your technique. So I always think that's a great message.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Like a lot of times, it's not always an excuse that it's always the hand's fault and we can't, climb on small holds because you can't get that extensibility. It's more, there's definitely ways to do it because there's definitely climbers that are doing it. And so that's where, still finger training, finger strength application is still a technical thing, but it's still more about the body position and the feet than it is about the hands, which I think is an important message for people to hear.
And you put that in your story last night. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was something to the effect of that was a hypothesis that people who are more flexible exert less force, maybe force over time. You might have even been talking about like over the course of a route than people who are less flexible. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, on average, like, and I think
Yeah.
about myself and people that I know and my athletes. It's like the people that aren't as flexible, they just on average have to apply a little bit more force, so their power is maybe a little bit higher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to translate to climbing harder because it's not as efficient. You burn energy faster. And so the other takeaway there is like the athletes that are at the elite level of our sport, they have both, and
Yeah.
so it's like you have strong fingers, you can tolerate grabbing on small holds, you have good technical mobility and skills. Those are the people that are in the Olympics, at the best level of our sport.
Yeah, I love watching really good. I feel like it's easier to see this on sport climbing or rope climbing, we'll say. And my buddy Ethan Pringle always he's flexible and he always climbs really tall and you'll just see him be on a, a sport climb and then almost always find like a stem or something to like take a ton of weight off of his hands, but really he's just being efficient. And that really stacks up move after move after move. And Ethan is not a tiny string bean climber, to be honest. He's one of the bigger guys, but he's kind of known for doing power endurance, long climbing. And, that efficiency there really, really adds up quick if you're mobile.
Absolutely.
Uh, Something that you mentioned earlier that I am not super familiar with, and I'm just now learning about is this. You said something about like a Talon grip or like this. I don't know. We're doing a podcast, but this is video, so it's hard to make an example. But like, is that almost like grabbing a doorknob or something? Like, what's the Talon grip, and what's its connection with having stronger fingers and hands for climbing?
The talon grip is something that I termed as it represents kind of the same position that a bird would use in their talons picking up an object. So it's different than a pinch, where a pinch is a half crimp with the addition of the thumb. But because the fingers are together, there aren't it's not as much of a stress to the intrinsic muscles of the hand, which are the palmar interossei. So there's muscles that live in the hand that live between the metacarpals that are responsible for bringing the fingers together. And so on a pinch we don't really stress those muscles very much because we don't have to, because the fingers are together. But if my fingers are apart, like grabbing a circular object, then I have to squeeze with my whole hand. So it's different than a pinch, and it's different than using like a hand dynamometer, and it's definitely different than hanging straight on your fingers. And there's three nerves that innervate the hand: the extrinsic muscles and the intrinsic muscles. And so to be more well-rounded, to be more comprehensive, it makes sense to train the hand muscles as well, because when we actually grab onto a hold, we bring the fingers together on like a small hold. And so it's just a more comprehensive approach, and not just about obsessing over the extrinsic finger flexors, which is half and half crimp positions.
So, do you think the Talon grip is something that we really should be training? You know, again with the goal of injury prevention for climbing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's also like, I think for me, for myself, I use that particular grip like every day that I climb. And then I also use some sort of unlevel edge as my strength training for climbing, and that's it. And then all of the other exposure comes from the climbing wall, or for some of my clients, if they don't have access to spray walls and system boards, then they can use a fingerboard as well for full crimp hanging stuff. And you certainly can use a fingerboard to strength train too, but like it's just a bit more muscular if we can have something that loads all four digits, kind of at the same time, and including the thumb with the Talon grip. But the other thing I like about the Talon grip is it's not as stressful on the PIP joint because the finger is still more of an obtuse joint angle.
Hmm. Okay, I don't want to get too far away from the fingers because they're complex enough as they are, but it just begs the question for me. Okay, so getting those intrinsic or God, maybe they're extrinsic, getting those the hand muscles stronger. is great because it clearly supports all the things we do as climbers. But then there's also the wrist. Like, how do you think about each step of this chain to make sure that we can exert as much force as possible with our fingers and stay as injury free as possible?
So I still think it's the function is to get the exposure and also to increase recruitment levels just so we have a lot of movement options. But again, it's not because we need to apply so much more force. It's really just a way to be more comprehensive with the hand so the athlete has a lot of practice time. So I'm a big fan of using some form of wrist strengthening. Like I like the wrist wrench for that tool. It's pretty easy to do, but it's definitely not the only way to train the wrist. And then some sort of open position that loads the intrinsic, which would intrinsic essentially just means muscles that are beyond the wrist that actually originate beyond the wrist. The extrinsic ones are, outside the wrist. They're more in the forearm. So the intrinsic muscles are the pads and the dabs, and then the lumbrical muscles. So the interossei and the lumbricals. And so we can train those pretty easily with something that's circular. And I use like an atomic climbing hold. They call them ninja balls. They use them for ninja warrior courses, but I've had clients screw like a eye bolt into I guess a stair newel post from like Home Depot, or a baseball, or something that's round that they can grab and add load to and squeeze and lift hard with. And then something for the extrinsic finger flexors, either on a fingerboard with an unlevel edge, like however you want to do it.
This is a risk question that I feel like a lot of climbers experience, that kind of pull out feeling on their wrist. When you like hit a big sloper, and it kind of feels almost like your wrist
Mm-hmm.
kind of dislocates a little bit. What is that? How dangerous is it? And how might we prevent that happening?
I think it's really about the volume of, and that's again another genetic thing. People that have lots of flexibility, they have more elastin in their connective tissues. They have less type 1 collagen, where I'm very opposite. I'm very stiff. And I was telling one of my clients this morning, like I don't really get shoulder, elbow, and wrist injuries. And like I beat myself up just like you do, this climber does, but like my body, because it's stiff, doesn't have good ranges of motion, but that's protective in a lot of ways. And so it's kind of a trade-off, where I find that people that have more mobility and they spend a lot of time in the drag or on slopers, they get a lot of shearing stress at the wrist because it's not a very muscular position, because the muscle is longer there than it is, so it just like can't produce as much torque at the joint. And so it's just really about the amount of volume that someone's doing on slopers, and people's risk is different. There's no way around that.
I hate that. I I'm not a fan of that feeling, and I'm probably on the more mobile side. I've had plenty of shoulder injuries. I always traced it back to gymnastics, and it is funny, just that idea of that spectrum of stiffness and flexibility, and there's pros and cons to each. And when people start doing a lot of yoga, people often hurt their back doing yoga. It's like they are weak and they can't support their spine, and they're getting into these really crazy positions. And so it's like mobility is good, strength is good, and you want some ability in both of them, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, you definitely want to do both of them, and you definitely don't want to think that anything is off limits totally, but it really is just about the dosage. Like for me, watching me do yoga, I joked with people last year. I was in Squamish teaching at the climbing medical symposium, and then my wife flew in and we went to Whistler and stayed at this cool resort in Whistler. And she's like, let's do a yoga class. And I was jokingly on my Instagram account like, who wants to watch me live stream this yoga class? It'll be the silliest thing you've ever seen. And people were like, please do it, like so psyched. And I wimped out at the last minute. But watching me do yoga is like a horrific experience, right? But that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing for me. It just means that I would really have to regress the intensity of that, because it might be something that would irritate my hip and my back. But it's good for people to challenge, those things that they feel like they can't do. There's nothing really that's off limits, but I think it's really helpful for people to understand that it's okay to maybe don't do the things that aren't as comfortable for you, and don't beat yourself up about feeling like you're missing out on some performance gain by not doing them. It's like because I used to do that when I was younger. I would push into those things, do lots of stretching and lots of things for my back, and in retrospect, it only made it worse. It didn't really help my overall like strength and performance.
The other thing I've noticed in my old age is that those things that you're naturally not so good at, but perhaps you really do need to get better at them, like this really small hold thing that I kind of have to be exposed to if I want to do my projects. Like there's just the rock won't change, so I've
Yep.
got to change a little bit. And even though there may be other lower hanging fruit such as technique, what I've noticed is that when I try to build a ability that doesn't come naturally for me, that I have to regress it significantly, way more than I think, and start really, really slow. And then I can see some benefits, but that part of the problem will be jumping in too fast and expecting something out of my body that just wasn't designed to do.
Yeah, like if I try and full crimp as much as my friend does, like my joints would be irritated, much more than his because I'm not used to the exposure and it's just not as comfortable to get into those positions. And so, in the context of what you're describing, one of the things that I do have athletes do as like a preparatory thing is you can do longer duration full crimp kind of positions, and that would work well on a fingerboard for like 15 to 30 seconds continuous to try and get a little bit of stress relaxation to the tissue. And if you do those things kind of as a habit, maybe 3 to 5 total prior to trying that thing, you should get a little bit better extensibility on the wall and on the hold. There's just like what people hear is people want to hear that do this and it's going to help you, and then they get help from it, and then they assume that doing that forever is going to continually make a change and it's continually going to make them not get injured. But as a consequence of doing something novel, like forever is a risk factor, and so everything is potentially risky. But so it's like it's important to have that thought process in the back of their mind that, oh, this is good for now, but I can't do this all winter time because that stimulus might be too high. But you want to lean into it when you need it.
Yeah, having those realistic expectations are it's hard, man. Like you get these, you see Dave Graham full crimp something, and you just think that, oh, if I stick with this long enough, I can do it too. But sometimes you're just not Dave Graham, and that I don't know. It's why it's nice to have a coach and someone like you looking over looking over athletes, or especially when you're the athlete, because sometimes you get in your head something that actually would just be injurious and hurt you in the long run because you're not the same as everyone else.
Yeah, my friend is very much built like Dave Graham, very long and lean and very flexible fingers, and just in general, and climbs accordingly.
But then famously, Dave Graham, I don't know if he's ever done a one arm pull up or he's done one. And he's maybe not built to be repping off 10 one-arm pull-ups, and he's found his own way. Boy, has he found his own way. He's doing just fine.
Yeah, doing just fine. And it's important and cool for people to hear that, to also know. And the thing that people tend to do is they tend to side with, an example and say, well, Dave Graham can't do a one arm pull up. Like, I guess pull up strength is not worth my time. And it's like, no, no, no. That's really not the point of thinking about that. I'm sure Dave Graham tries to train pull strength just like everyone else does. His predisposition for doing certain things is just going to be different. And so for those things, it's not going to be good. So if he was to lean into that too hard and be like, I'm going to spend my year trying to do a one arm pull up, it might lead to an injury risk that's not worth it and or necessary for him. But that does not mean that training pull strength isn't a good idea still. It just means that he needs to accept that it's slightly different than someone like myself who has really short lever arms. One arm pull ups are really easy for me. But seeing what I do doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the same outcome because I didn't do anything. That's just how I was built.
By the way, I feel like you're the only trad dad I know that can do one arm pull-ups. There's just not that many people who climb hard trad and you have 4 kids and you can do one arm pull. Just usually that sentence doesn't come out. So very cool, man. Sounds like you're born with that gift, but still congrats. Very cool.
Yeah, it's a leverage thing. Like I can probably without like I've been doing pull-ups lately, weighted pull-ups, 2 arms lately, but I could probably do 5 one-arm pull-ups. Just like, but that's really just because I have short arms, but good leverage. So the moment arm based on the length is really good.
Yeah.
So it's really just a physics thing.
Kind of the meta topic here is someone like Dave Graham is these athletes that really do well and have maybe done well often without coaches in the past is this ability to really understand what you need to progress. And it's a really hard topic. And I think it's why we're talking about all this stuff and taking these extreme examples, is because at the end of the day, you have to move forward and you have to train in the way that's appropriate for you, not Dave Graham, and for you in that moment and in that stage of life too, which is all that stuff is so hard to balance, man. I just wanted to point out, like, that's sometimes what makes these athletes great, is that they find that path. It's not just that they look at some anecdote and then go all out like Dave Graham, spending the next 3 years trying to do one and pull up. That's not how Dave Graham got to where he is.
And I'm sure all the pro athletes that you talk to, and if you hear their story and they give you a timeline, they've been exposing themselves to a working hypothesis for however many years. It's always changing. And it's never, I only do this because this works for me all the time. It's like, I did this for a period of time and then I didn't do that, but then I switched and I did this. And most of the time, if you actually hear what they're spending time climbing at the same time as they change their training, it's like, that was pretty smart. Like, they're definitely making good training decisions for themselves that wouldn't necessarily apply to the general public and wouldn't necessarily apply to people that go to the climbing gym and climb on plastic. And so the one thing that they have that, a lot of us don't have is a lot of time to spend practicing on rock and actually putting in all of the, moments learning about all that stuff, which is like really hard to replicate on a board or inside, which is, everyone's envious. I'm super envious of that. I don't have that kind of time.
Oh yeah, they're professionals. Not much else. I mean, that's what they do. This brings me to this concept that I think you termed it Tim Gabbett's paradox. This idea of strength training being a protective mechanism, as well as allowing you to have uh, more ability, more, I don't know what the word is there, I'm blanking, just the ability to like tolerate extra volume in your climbing by doing these these strength training exercises. Can you just kind of pick that apart, that Tim Gabbett's paradox? Because I think that's somewhere where people get stuck, where they're like, okay, if I do too much, I'm going to get hurt, but I need to do some strength training to help me not get hurt. And it's like this kind of catch 22 feeling.
Yeah, so that's the paradox, and Tim is one of like lots of researchers that study training loads and both extrinsic training loads and intrinsic training loads and how they influence athletes' adaptation and performance. And so the paradox is, as you described, it's, we're kind of stuck in a place where knowing that strength training has some sort of protective benefit and training in general has some sort of protective benefit, but also knowing that doing too much of it is a risk factor for getting injured. So it really boils down to people thinking about general programming and periodization, which periodization is just a term used to describe, I'm planning out my training for some period of time with some progressive overload, knowing that it has to change or it's going to change at some point. So it's really about having more forethought as to the stuff you're doing, why you're doing it, when it's going to end, and why it's going to end, and what you're going to do afterwards. Right? So it's really about planning variation into athletes' lives, where the strength training is just one component. And off season, when people don't need a lot of fitness, they're going to do more of it. But when the season gets closer, they're definitely going to do less of it. And then when it's in the season, they can stop doing it, in the typical twice a week weight room style. And that's okay, knowing that at the end of a season, they're going to do it again. So it's really kind of a broad roadmap, let's say, to help athletes not get hurt while they still can train.
It all totally makes sense, and periodization totally makes sense. My anecdotal experience, as well as what I see in general climbers, is that it's just hard for them to plan and figure it out. Like, is there any kind of basic guidelines that you can give someone where they should maybe take their foot off the gas, or should they just think about it in terms of a trip? Like, I think that often happens naturally for people. They'll book a trip and they're like, okay, I'm psyched, and then they'll train for it, and then once they do the trip, they're exhausted, and so they take time off. I think it's sometimes a lot to ask for weekend warriors, or even, I mean, I guess I'm a weekend warrior at this point, to like really periodize, like just how do you kind of integrate that into a normal person's life?
Yeah, so I think it's probably easier to think about prioritizing strength as something that you do kind of all the time. Just because if someone is strong, it should be easier to build their power and it should be easier to build their capacity. We just need to kind of change how we're training over a period of time and get them ready for a season. But if I only climb, let's say, and this is really common for people that only rope climb, I only rope climb. I go to the gym 3 times a week and rope climb in the winter. And then when the summer comes around, I rope climb twice in the gym and then rope climb twice on the weekend and no other training. It's really hard for those athletes to make progress in terms of getting stronger, to climb harder grades. At some point, they're going to plateau. If they'd been strength training, let's say in the winter time, it would allow them to practice at a little bit higher intensity on average when the season comes around. Right. And so I think about it more as like a percentage of total training time. So we have like a finite amount of stuff in the week. And when you're not like trying to send something outside, whether that's bouldering or sport climbing or a big wall, and you have a couple months where that's not the focus, that's a good time to lean in and do more strength training stuff. But when it's a couple months away, then the strength training stuff needs to be less of a total percentage of the week. And then we need to have more climbing stuff involved. And for me personally, I think strength training the fingers before you climb each day is enough finger strength training that anyone needs to do. Like, I wouldn't really feel like there's a big need to do more. So we can always kind of keep that in the routine to some degree at a low volume, and then make sure we always prioritize climbing practice.
What does that strength training before climbing look like for the fingers typically?
So I'll have people do maybe a mix of 3 things, not 3 every session, because that might be a little much, but either use some sort of wrist focused thing, which would satisfy an open handed strength training thing. So when I think about the wrist wrench, I think about that's an open handed finger strength, wrist strength tool, as well as it includes the thumb. So I would do lifts from the ground or use some sort of strain gauge to measure it, but lifting from the ground is pretty easy. And I'll do like 1 set of 8, then do some other things, another set of 6, do some other things, do a set of 4, and just increasing the load every set. And then another thing I would use an unlevel edge, lift from the ground, or people could also do this on a fingerboard and do a set of 8, just a couple seconds each, another set of 6, another set of 4. But make sure that the stimulus, the intensity is harder on the tissue than rock climbing. And then that's it. Then your rock climbing session is your rock climbing session. If an athlete needs a lot of small crimp coordination practice, then they're going to maybe do some of that before their normal climbing session. If they need practice on steep terrain, on pinches, then they're going to use that as their coordination training session. If they are exposed to lots of things, maybe they'll mix sets. And so it really is about providing a stimulus on the hands and fingers all the time, knowing that it's a priority, but not that it needs to be like this big multiple days per week intentional practice thing, because that, in my opinion, misses the point of why we strength train anyways.
I had to just look up what the wrist wrench was because I thought I knew what it was, but I was totally wrong. It's kind of like a big open hand. Gosh, it's like almost like a giant bar, and then you can twist it. I don't know what the anatomical
Well,
term would
the
be.
wrist wrench is one tool. You could also use like the rolling thunder, which is like
Okay.
a grip like sport competition thing. It's essentially the same thing as the wrist wrench. It just rolls, and so you load below it. I also will have people use the end of a barbell in a squat rack. It's a little bit smaller in its diameter, but that also works. It's essentially just something more circular that you grab with your fingers more open and you just lift something really heavy.
And so you encourage us to keep this basic strength training up the whole year. And I also just like that it's connected with each session because I've been doing that a little bit more myself. And it's because if I don't do it then, there's a good chance I won't do it later. I mean, if I'm going to go climbing, I'm going to be committed to going to the gym or outdoors and and doing some kind of exercise. But if you ask me to add another session, at night, in the middle of a busy day, it may not happen. And so then that strength training and that exposure just never happens. Uh, do you taper that in season? Like, is it something that, like, how do you think about the intensity throughout the year?
I think what you're describing is the same reason that I like it as part of the warm up is it always gets done. And then you don't have to question like when do I do it? How do I feel? Am I tired? Is this load an adaptable load? And if we get even more detailed with like measuring different types of contractions on the fingers versus if I'm standing and curling my fingers into something and I'm measuring them, or if I'm pulling with my upper body or hanging on a fingerboard, the pulling in on your fingers is more concentric. That's more representative of someone's muscular strength and muscular fatigue. And so when I have measured athletes doing that or done this as examples for like my own research, it's really hard to know when your fingers are tired on a fingerboard because after a session, you can still do what look like really muscular things on the fingerboard. But that shouldn't really be possible if your fingers are tired. And so from my perspective, getting it done in the warm up is always a place to make it a habit where it just gets done. And then we can just like be comfortable not worrying about it. In terms of like the progression, I think the progression, everyone will know their progression like plateau. And it's not reasonable to think that we're going to continually adapt over time. There's going to be a plateau. But again, I don't think that that's that big of a deal as long as the athlete is not sore, they're not experiencing like something that gives them any pause for maybe this is I'm not adapting to these loads. And as long as they're trying hard and they're slowly inching up the numbers and they're doing it, that's the whole point of doing it off the wall in the first place.
I want to just say that again and again, that it's really a big mind shift for me, where it's not about trying to spike your numbers on those strength training so that you will now all of a sudden be able to grab that grip on your project. It's to continually expose yourself for safety reasons and allow you to have more volume doing the sport you love, which will lead to coordination, technique, and strength gains through the actual sport itself. I don't know. I guess that's probably obvious to you, but for some reason, it's like it's just very different from how I grew up. Uh, I I want to know more about this finger curl idea. I think that's like something that's just I've never really done. When I was younger, sometimes we'd do, I guess we called them like fingertip pull-ups, where you'd hang kind of open hand and pull into a full crimp. Talk a little bit more about this idea of curling your fingers against resistance.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more of an active position. So when you watch people do, and the cool thing that I was going to say about what we described as like warm up options and progressions and a stimulus is there's so many different ways you can do that, right? And the reality is your fingers don't care, like they really don't care as long as you're getting a stimulus that attempts to load all four fingers, that has an intentionally active position, which will limit how much actual load you're putting on the fingers, but it will be more of a muscular stress. Your body will adapt accordingly. And that number is going to look different for everyone. And that's okay. Like the inter-individual comparison, I think it's not that reasonable because it either makes people feel like they climb like shit because their fingers are strong, or it makes people feel like their fingers aren't strong, so they need to do more finger strength training. It's like we're all just different, and you want to like that's your numbers, great. Keep pushing it regardless of your strength level as much as you can, but don't push it to where you get hurt because that doesn't make any sense. Right. So if you were to like and what you're describing on the fingerboard, I think makes sense. And when my clients use a fingerboard, I'll have them pick a load that they're limited by how much they can curl in and hold that position. So imagine going up to a fingerboard at, let's say, body weight, and you grab onto the board. And instead of just like getting at 90 degrees and lowering your body, get a slightly open position, like 110 degrees, and curl into it like you're going to do a full crimp and hold that position. And so what the muscle shortening does is the muscle shortening is mostly based on the motors. And so to shorten a muscle, the muscle fibers have to attach and shorten. And then when I pick my feet up, I load my muscle fibers, but then I load some of the connective tissue at the ends and to the side of the muscle fiber. If I go straight to a fingerboard and I get set up in 90 degrees and I lower, and my intention is to lower, then I'm also loading my muscle fibers, but I'm loading the connective tissues at the end of the muscle fibers. So it's a slightly different type of isometric muscle contraction, which provides a heavier external load, but not more muscle fiber activity.
When I think of this finger curling, I don't think of it as isometric though, right? Isn't it like you're moving through, that's concentric, right? So that's way more muscular than just going into a full crimp and just being stuck there, right? So
And yeah. And so the curling part is not really like full curling range of motion under load. It's like
oh,
it's a
okay.
subtle shortening, but it's called an overcoming isometric. So it's like you're trying to curl into the hold, but you're not really doing a full finger curl. Where you're trying to pull the edge towards you, let's say, where in a other style, the yielding isometric, you're trying to not fall open.
Hmm.
Does that
And
make
isn't that
sense?
how people typically get hurt too? Isn't that the position that people often get hurt in, that like opening cycle?
Yeah, it's usually a rapid load though. I don't talk to
Hmm.
many people that have heard a pop or had a finger injury directly on a fingerboard. I'm sure it's happened, but that's not as nearly as common as someone with their hands on and a foot slips and then they quickly open the joint.
I see. Yeah. PSA really quick there. Don't get hurt training. You can control all the variables. If you get hurt training, it was just you weren't thinking. Like it's very different to have a foot pop or a foothold break and you get hurt. And just do not get hurt on the fingerboard. You should not get hurt on the fingerboard.
And that's a big part of my kind of thought process and hypotheses on these different ideas for finger strength training is the bias is I talk to people with finger injuries, and when we just hear what people do, it's not one thing. It's definitely not finger training. It's climbing training and fingerboarding or finger training and lifting weights and other sports. And really, it's not that anything's good or bad. It's really just people need to think about the total combination of all of those things and how it affects tissues like the fingers, because the fingers are the smallest joint that we load in the entire body when we're climbing, and it's loaded at such a high intensity and repetition that not considering that a risk factor on the fingerboard is silly. That definitely is one of the risk factors for sure. So it's always kind of with that in mind.
I just got a force meter, like a Tyndek. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
how do you put that into use in your practice?
So there's a ton of different ways to use it. It's really easy to quantify and measure maximum strength. It's really simple to measure rate of force development. So how quickly someone can generate force in a certain time frame, which is probably more important than strength training. And in any other sport, like let's say the NFL combine, the strongest athlete, the brute strongest athlete is not the best athlete. And coaches know that, recruiters know that. The athletes that can express force dynamically on off on the field are the best athlete, right? And so that's a really important metric. And then I also have my athletes test anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, aerobic capacity. So that thing is just a tool that can be used that can be a bit more precise in its measurement, methods, but also it's easy to reproduce. So if I'm trying to measure someone's, let's say, aerobic capacity, I can have them fix like a percentage of their max and have them do repeaters for repetitions. And if I want to retest that, I can make it the exact same. So it's just a tool that's very easy to use. It's very objective and fun to use, but it has a whole bunch of different uses.
It's funny that you mentioned that idea of the people who are the strongest in the weight room typically aren't the top athletes. I've heard that a bunch of times where it's like you see the running back who squats the most is not the star running back. Like those
Mm-hmm.
really star athletes typically are. I want to say they're bad in the weight room. It'd be ridiculous to think you take some NFL running back and they can't squat a ton, but that's not where you really see their specialty lies, that force production. So let's talk a little bit about that difference between strength, power, and endurance in that spectrum? Because you kind of referred to that when you're talking about the sport climbers who only sport climb and just where strength fits in. So can you break down that spectrum a little bit and how they're related?
Yeah, so athletes that can produce lots of force, they tend to, in a lot of cases, it might be based on their moment arm. So essentially, the moment arm is the length, the distance of the attachment length from the axis of rotation. So if we talk about that at the end of the fingers, if I have a longer attachment distance, I have the ability to produce more torque. So at the same intensity at the muscle, it's a more efficient type of movement. So that athlete can do a lot of repetitions at the same intensity based on their leverage. The downside of that is it's slower, right? So further distance has to take more time to shorten. And so there's so many weird variables. And if you think about the human body, that applies to the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the fingers. Like there are so many moving parts, but that definitely is what differentiates athletes genetically. It's just like people are built how they're built, and so people have a natural predisposition for a certain discipline. And most people that aren't trying to be generalists or not trying to challenge that, they kind of fall into the thing that they're the best at, which is totally reasonable and good. And so in order for athletes to like improve at that particular thing that they're good at, that usually requires them to like challenge some of the things that they're not as good at. So most sport climbers, that I call it the old guy crew, that all go to the gym, and I've been going sport climbing once a week for the last like 3 weeks. But it's people I've climbed with before at the gym, and they're all older and have jobs and kids, and they're still there climbing at the gym, but they're all climbing at the same grade for the most part. And so it's really that they're not really taking time to like do more bouldering than sport climbing. So they're not on average doing harder moves. They're not on average grabbing smaller holds. So their finger strength is not going up, their power output is not going up, but their fitness is really good at a given intensity. And so it really kind of, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it really requires athletes to, maybe spend time doing the things physiologically and metabolically that aren't like the sport they're doing. Like I'm doing sport climbing once a week because I want to build some fitness. I might do some trad climbing this fall, but what I've noticed for bouldering is it's my bouldering strength hasn't gone down at all, but my ability to have like more hard efforts has gone up just from the aerobic and the capacity component too. So it's maybe one way to think about it. Athletes can think about, if you're primarily a sport climber, there's a good reason for a period of your training season to boulder and don't do so much sport climbing, and vice versa for bouldering athletes in sport climbing.
I think that I've always been under this assumption that absolute strength is is the fundamental limiter and the hardest thing to get. So when I think of sport climbing, and a lot of sport climbers will say like, "Oh, if I can do the move, then I can do the route," because they just think, you just have to keep on climbing, and if you're not stopped by here, then you can build that fitness and have that endurance. But that fundamentally, if you aren't strong enough to do a specific move, that you're limited by absolute strength. So yeah, I guess more my question was kind of that relationship between strength, power, and endurance. Like, um, what does it take? I don't know. I'm looking for here. Am I right thinking that strength is kind of like the most important component on that spectrum? That if you are strong, you can end up building endurance, but that's kind of harder to go the other way, and that someone who is quite well versed in endurance, kind of is limited by their absolute strength.
Yes, I think most people would agree that strength training is the thing that takes a good amount of time to develop. And that comes from like developing the tissue quality in your connective tissues. So the joint cartilage, the ligaments around the joints, the muscle, the tendons, takes time for the material changes to happen, material property changes to happen in those tissues. And also to be like to get access to a lot of muscle fibers. But there's always a genetic limit there too. Some people that are just like slender have a really hard time getting more cross sectional area or hypertrophy in their muscle fiber. So there's a ceiling there too. But it again kind of falls back on the idea of it's really about tissue quality and making sure the athlete can tolerate high intensity things. So when they go sport climbing, because like my experience in the gym, like climbing 512, plus 513 minus in the gym is physically not that hard move to move. But it's just like I just for the really long routes at 513, like I've only tried hard last Monday. Like I could do all the moves really easy, but 3/4 of the way up, I just like gas out, right? And so like it really is like an adaptation that if I lean into that and only do that, I'm going to lose that top end strength and power. So it's really kind of want to like strategically program for yourself that fine point where the strength and the power are still there, but you've developed the endurance. Because if you just keep going in the endurance route, you're going to lose those things, and vice versa with strength and power.
Well, I guess my plan is that when you're younger, it seems like you can build this strength and hold on to it. Like you were saying, you started doing more sport climbing, but you don't really feel like your strength has gone down that much when bouldering. And I just always feel like the older I get, the more I can head towards endurance sport. There's always this joke in my crew where it's like you're young, you boulder, and then when it just becomes too much and your performance isn't going up, you start doing a little more sport climbing, then maybe a little more trad climbing, and then maybe we're just going to be walking and hiking instead of trying to have that hardcore power output. But what I also hear you saying is that you really need to maintain strength to support the demands of volume in whatever discipline you're enjoying.
And the good news for athletes is it doesn't need to be a lot of stuff. Like I have enough strength training background and enough physical strength that I strength train like every 3 or 4 days. Like that's it. But I only will do like 3 to 4 exercises, but they're always intense, and they always are like physically pushing how much load I can move. So some sort of pulling movement, some sort of pushing movement, some sort of squat or hip hinge movement, and then something additional for the shoulders. And certainly that's going to be slightly different for different people, but if we can like stick, and that's what the science would suggest, is if we can stick with like those 4 multi-joint compound really intense exercises and we just do them regularly, you don't have to worry about anymore. So you don't always need a big structured like progressive training program with all these different things in it. You just need the stimulus to make sure your tissues can tolerate it.
Can we talk a little bit more about rate of force development and how that may be related to what we term contact strength in climbing?
Yeah, so contact strength is the strength required to contact and hold on to a hold, maybe is an easy way of describing it. But it definitely is not about maximum force. Maximum force of an athlete matters, but an athlete's ability to produce a percentage of that maximum matters more. So the example would be Allison versus Alex. Alex has much better contact strength, but Allison has much stronger fingers. So even though one maximum strength is higher than the other, if we measure them at, let's say, 200 milliseconds, the one that can apply force smoothly and quickly there repetitively probably has the advantage in a sport where you grab holds quickly. And we don't grab holds super quickly in climbing, but there's definitely a component where it needs to be smooth and coordinated, and again, like as balanced as possible based on the positioning of the lower body. So it's like we want to focus on, I need to increase my contact strength, therefore I need to use a fingerboard without my feet because it's all about crash, crash, crash. But like that's not really what happens when you watch someone on a climbing wall and you slow down their movement. It's like a perfect distance and their feet are on, but their body is balanced underneath it. And when they hit the hold, they quickly like slow down. So it's as much of a deceleration thing as it is an acceleration thing. So it's like not just like how fast you can generate force. It's like how quickly can you hit it and then release tension so you can hold on. So it's like incredibly complicated physiologically, but like if we train rate of force development and we feel we need someone to increase our rate of force development, that's pretty easy to do with the Tindeck too.
Yeah, what I heard there is that contact strength, as we think about in climbing, like jumping and latching, or not even necessarily jumping, just latching a big dynamic move, is about a lot more than just your ability to grab that hold with your hand. That there's a huge element of just, when you just hit something, you're almost kind of like weightless for that half a second, and it almost gives you time to settle into that hold. And I know you also pointed out that there's going to be physiological differences for people who can produce power over time in a different manner. It actually makes me think of when I was in college and I was doing some weightlifting, and I had a buddy who was a power lifter, and he could squat and deadlift a lot more than me. But then when we did jumping or cleans, kind of like Olympic lifting where you had to throw it, he was the same strength as me, or had the same ability as me, but it was really just like our leg movement arm I had. I was able to produce more power, even though he was stronger than me, which I thought was interesting. So, uh, if you are looking to increase your contact strength, maybe you do think it's a problem beyond technique. How do you do that with the Tindeck?
So I typically would have people, because it's a muscular thing. Ultimately, we want the majority of that practice to be on the climbing wall, no doubt. But if we're trying to target the ability of the fast twitch fibers to contract at their normal speed, which is fast, we can train that. And so I would use a edge that loads all four fingers, some unlevel edge, and I would have people stand vertically with their knees straight and their elbows straight and their hand on the edge, kind of in an open position. And then the Tindeck has a countdown feature where then at 0, you just like have a little bit of tension and you just contract into it as quickly as you can for like 1 second.
Okay, let's talk more about this unlevel edge. I've never used one, but it seems like there's a ton of benefits, especially when you're really just taking this focus of, let's try to increase strength in the hands and fingers. And it's not so much like, let's see if we can, fit onto this little crimp, like it, just really taking that step back instead of the specificity for a hold. We're just kind of talking about strength training and the protective effects of that. Yeah. Let's go more into the ergo edge and why you like it so much.
So it's really an attempt to separate training from sports practice, right? If you think about, let's say, the first thing that came to my mind was like a lineman in football. Like a lineman in football needs to extend at the hips very quickly, and they need to be able to push another human and block them from all these different directions. So what they do in their off season or for their strength training is they do bench press and they do hip extension, like deadlifting, squatting, etc. Right? You don't see them trying to get stronger moving an object that's not stable or trying to replicate their sport as much as just targeting muscle groups and movement patterns and overloading them with the strength training principles that are pretty well established now. And so their sport practice is the most important, but there's a reason that they use something that's not their sport because it's just an easier tool to understand, to track. It's safer, right? And so like those two are they are important for each other, but they don't need to look like each other. And so the justification for the unlevel edge is essentially finding a way to just load all four fingers in a hopefully a more symmetric way instead of an edge that's flat, which kind of makes you cram your fingers onto it, because most people's fingers are not the same length. I don't, some people's are pretty dang close, which is amazing, but most people's pinkies are much shorter and their fingers are not the same length. So in order to like increase my recruitment and the stiffness to my tissues, those tendons all have the same muscle belly in the forearm. And so it's simply an attempt at giving someone a training tool that they can access more muscle fibers with that loads the fingers evenly, which also reduces a little bit of the rotational stress we put on the PIP joint versus using a flat edge.
I see. Okay, then am I right to kind of think about pulling on a comfy ergo or unlevel edge from the ground and saying like an isometric, like using the Tindeck, something that just doing that to a max ability is the best way to test general finger strength in the context that we're talking about. We're not talking about can you crimp this thing on the swarm. We're just talking about the musculature and physiology with the goal of protecting ourselves from the demands of our sport. Is that like kind of the most isolated, best example of stressing your that chain, the ergo or the unlevel edge from the ground in a comfy way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a new enough concept that it hasn't been researched, so I think people will maybe in like a strict randomized controlled trial methodology. But if we look at our science, it's like it's hard to do good research in climbing. There's not a lot of money. And so it's always kind of like we need more and more stuff of it. But from my own personal research, I have probably 120 athletes that have tested with me or sending me their numbers. And essentially, the argument can be made if you can produce more force on that edge versus a flat edge, then it's probably more representative of muscular force. And almost every person, I think there's a few exceptions, but almost everyone's numbers are higher with an unlevel edge versus a flat edge. And so it's really just trying to find a way to stress more of the muscle and more of the tendons at the same time is really all that it's trying to do.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just really powerful having a basic movement that I can just check in with and say, are my fingers getting stronger or not? And that's very different, as we've talked about ad nauseum this whole time. That's very different from saying, and I then crushed my crimpy project in Bishop. We're not talking about that. We're saying, are my muscles getting exposed in the way they need to be to hopefully increase my numbers slowly, at the very least maintain, so that I know I'm loading myself and having those protective effects. And just to me, Tyler, that's like super powerful to just break it down to that, instead of saying, okay, I need to check my 2-finger pocket strength, which my back two, my front two, like it gets so complex, and just having something to touch base on and just say, like, how am I doing? Yeah, how am I doing? Is really helpful for me, man.
Yeah, the grip position thing is interesting because if you look at one of the older books that's actually pretty good, I think the Anderson Brothers book, there's a lot of positions on the fingerboard. And that book was made, I think, before there was spray walls at that point, and definitely in the UK, but there wasn't like boards like there is now. And so there's like kind of it was a very functional thing that they needed to expose themselves to all these different positions because maybe they didn't have access to climbing walls that had all those grip types. And so in that context, it makes total sense that that would be something that fit that need. Nowadays, like everyone, like we're so spoiled with the amount of climbing surfaces that we have to practice on. And so at this point, I would say if you're spending a lot of time practicing on the wall, which we all should be in the gym setting, on a board, on a spray wall, you're getting a lot of exposure on the fingers to those different grips. If you're someone that is climbing on pockets often, you might need a little bit more, but you can get that on the kilter board more intentionally or spray walls. But if I try and do that amount of stuff, which is normal for my sport, and then I try and get it on the fingerboard too, that's just too much of a repetitive stress that's hard to understand and hard to know the outcomes of, where it just makes more sense to be simple with it and choose something that's more muscular, that definitely is safe, and then get all that exposure and think about that all as your climbing practice.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, what I'm hearing from that too is, yes, you can use that unlevel edge and the tin deck to see how your muscular strength is doing. But if you're going to go Franken for the first time, and let's face it, even though there is a lot of different holds on the modern climbing walls, there's actually not that many pockets. And if you're going to go to a place that's predominantly pockets and you've never grabbed one, might be good to expose yourself to that, ideally while climbing. But if you can't, then you can do some pocket training on a fingerboard to
For
try.
sure, use a
Yeah.
fingerboard. And I have clients that do that, or they'll go to the Wild Iris and have them do,
Oh, geez. Yeah.
not a separate session, but like a bouldering session or like a sport climbing session. Like, how many approximate moves are you going to need to do at that crag? And then you want to create some sort of 50 to 50% body weight to 75% body weight, like doing repeaters on fingerboards with different grips as part of your climbing session to make sure that you're getting that exposure. But it doesn't necessarily make sense to me to do hard bouldering session and then later in the day do a bunch of repeaters on the fingerboard, because now you're just providing a stimulus to the fingers that is different enough that you're used to. That is what most of the what's called the ACWR research would say is a sharp increase in load. That's one of the most risky things you can do. It's not that the tool is risky itself. It's really just the total increase in load went up too fast. That's
I
the
see.
risk.
So whenever we're talking about training, there's always this level of specificity. There's like if you want to climb to bolt or not to be in Smith Rock, the best thing to do is to try climbing to bolt or not to be in Smith Rock. Like it's, if you're trying to do a thing, doing it is going to be the most specific example of training for that thing. And then, as you get away from that, maybe you set a replica on your spray wall or whatever the case may be. And, we've talked a lot about how doing finger training is not necessarily the goal of specificity. And you're saying that when you get strong on this unlevel edge pulling from the ground, you're now going to do to bolt or not to be. That's not the message you're saying. And now I want to understand how far out on the spectrum you think we should go, where you talked about linebackers who come out of their gosh, I don't even know the script, they start out, then the football gets hiked, and then the linebackers jump up and smash into someone. So yeah, hip extension, pushing. So no big surprise that in the weight room they're doing squats and bench presses. Something that I maybe have pushed back on in the climbing is a lot of this interest in squats or deadlifts or bench presses for climbing, because it's, I don't know, I have my thoughts on it, but you know how how far out on that spectrum of specificity should we get when we think about it applying to climbing? Like, do you, I know we were just going to talk about fingers today, Tyler, but now we're talking about squatting because you brought up the linebacker. How do you think about when you get far on that spectrum away from specificity and how it still does or does not apply to climbing?
So I think there I would say again, um, the adaptations that we get from an exercise are the specific things, not really how it looks. And so, like as an athlete, as a climber, you are exposed to wide positions on the climbing wall. You're exposed to overhead positions on the climbing wall where you're at max reach. And if you watch like someone climb and slow it down, they grab onto a hold and then they lean back a little bit. So it's a shoulder extension, right? And the first muscle that's used in shoulder extension is the clavicular fibers of the pec. So the upper pec is the first muscle that is used like in a pull up if we look at like the EMG research. And so the pec is not, in my opinion, trained because it's going to make someone climb better. I just want to make someone's shoulder stronger so they can do harder climbing movements more frequently. And the bench press is just a really easy way to overload the chest and the anterior deltoid muscle, right? And pull-ups, like people could do vertical pull-ups on a pull-up bar, or they could do horizontal pulling on a seated row machine. In my opinion, the difference between those two is insignificant for most climbers, how the exercise looks, as long as they're picking one that they have equipment for, they enjoy doing, and they can progressively overload it. The point there again is not because athletes are too strong for pulling and they shouldn't do it. The point really is to give athletes protection in the tissues and the ligaments around the joint so they can practice their sport more. So the whole idea that bench pressing is not like rock climbing or like seated rows aren't like rock climbing is insignificant in my opinion. That's not the point of those exercises, is not to look like rock climbing. And again, the only way it's going to benefit any of those are going to benefit rock climbing is if people are practicing rock climbing more. That's just all there is to it, right? And so there's a lot of confusion, people thinking that they have to like do bench pressing or some sort of pressing movement because it's an antagonist, because it's opposite to climbing. That is just straight confusing and just makes people do all sorts of crazy things, but that is not more protective. It is not safer for athletes. It is really a very misrepresented, like, I guess, example of why we would do strength training in the first place.
So just like there's a ceiling on the, maybe not ceiling, there's diminishing gains to be had when a climber's fingers are already really strong. And so that concept must apply to the rest of the body as well, where, if you can squat, I don't know, I'm just X pounds, squatting X plus 1 pounds at some point isn't worth the risk. That doesn't mean that you don't want to still be squatting to provide that protective benefit, but how do you think about that when we're talking about the rest of the body, your shoulders, in comparison to the fingers?
Yeah, 100%. I think the same principle applies to the rest of the body. There's a point at which pushing beyond it, if it's an extra strain on the athlete or they're too worried about the numbers, then it becomes a point of diminishing returns. The other thing that we haven't really talked about a ton, because we've just kind of talked about strength training, is the periodization component of it, where the periodization component of it is I want to make someone, get more recruitment and get more stiffness in the chest, but I definitely want them to be more explosive for rock climbing. So, like, in addition to the strength training stuff, I have most of my athletes do off the wall warm up stuff where they're doing explosive stuff before getting on the wall, because the other downside that we've talked about a little bit about getting too strong is you're going to be slower. It definitely will make you less powerful if the focus is only heavy resistance training, because heavy resistance training is naturally slow. It will activate the big muscle fibers, the fast twitch fibers, but we also have to train them to be coordinated at that particular range of motion and at that speed too. And so one of the tenets of periodization is changing the set rep scheme and the way that we use the exercise to have a lowered intensity and to be much more explosive in preparation for a sport or a season or a trip, to make sure that we're like actually addressing the type of muscle contraction that we will use when we're climbing.
So do you front load in the periodization? Do you front load strength then? Is because isn't am I right to think that strength, although fundamentally slower, because if you're moving the max amount of weight, it's going to go at a slower rate. So it's, I mean, just by definition. And then as you get more explosive, it's going to be, it has to be less weight. You front load that strength part and then start to focus more on the explosiveness after that.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of the cool thing about like coaching and exercise science is there's a whole bunch of ways that people do it and they have done it in the past. And so there's probably not one answer for that. It's certainly that just depends on the person. Like for me, because of my mechanics and my like my muscle fiber types, like I get strong really fast. And so for you could take someone like me and you could do a strength day and a power day and a strength day and a power day and a strength day and a power day. You could like alternate them. You could also do strength movement followed by a power movement, which is the same movement or range of motion, just a lower intensity. Or for athletes that maybe don't have the strength background, they could do 4 to 5 weeks of strength training and then transition to something that's powerful, which is a more classic periodization method. And so there's different camps there and different styles of doing it. And there's really not that like one is better than the other. But, that's where it gets kind of hard to know for individuals to know, like, what am I doing? Am I doing the wrong things? I mean, but most of the time, as long as the athlete is still spending the majority of their focus and time rock climbing, they're probably getting a pretty high velocity stimulus and a moderate power output stimulus. And so with all the off the wall things, we can probably make it a little bit more simple and really just focus on, as long as someone's hitting, let's say 75 to 85% like maximum with their strength sessions regularly, that's probably enough. Pushing more beyond that is probably not going to directly transfer to climbing performance, because again, at some point there's going to be a point where it's just like diminishing returns.
Yeah, gosh, you really got to know yourself or have a coach overseeing you is what I keep hearing too. It's so hard to, it's so unique and different for each person, but that's why we're trying to set those guidelines up, those guardrails of extremes. Uh, I we kind of touched on this, but I want to go a little bit into morphology and the differences that you've seen, and you've done a bunch of ultrasounding on climbers' fingers. We've glossed over a bit, but what is morphology? What have you seen when ultrasounding people's fingers, and how do you use that to help athletes depending on what you see there?
I hopefully when we do ultrasound scans for that intentionally, we don't make people feel bad or make people feel overly confident. It's the morphology is just like the shape of things, and the shape can change a little bit. Like we talked about youth climbers, their structure will change a little bit as they develop. Once they get skeletally mature, it's not going to change as much with the exception of injuries, but it's just something that's kind of fixed. And so when we measure someone's, the original idea I had behind doing a bunch of ultrasound measures of fingers is just kind of challenging or thinking about the idea of like the use of a 20 mil edge, like, because if all we do is use a 20 mil edge and we overload it, that's not an edge that supports the DIP joint. So in order to like go really heavy, we have to put a decent amount of stress at the DIP joint because it's not covered. So my original idea was like, well, how many people's fingers are that much less than 20 millimeters to show that it does support the edge? And not that many people. So a 20 mil edge doesn't really cover that many people's DIP joints. So at the same time, I was just kind of curious as to tendon, what's the moment arm length between different people. And like we've already talked about, someone that has a longer moment arm or a longer tendon attachment has more potential for torque. And if you ask them, it's really interesting. When you ask them, you're like, are your fingers feel strong, but they're not as snappy and powerful? They're like, yes. But people that have the opposite, they're like, I feel like I grab things fast, but I can't produce a lot of force. So it's really just like a applied physics of biomechanics thing, which is interesting to differentiate why people do certain things. But it also, for me, hopefully helps me educate people that there's just some hard realities of how we're built. And if you're someone that falls into the camp of my fingers get sore if I use a 20 mil edge, regardless of what I want to do with my finger training. I've tried it for years and I keep getting hurt. Just don't use a 20 mil edge. Use a 30 millimeter edge, because the original, when I started looking into this maybe 5-6 years ago, that was like the thing to do. Everyone used a 20 mil edge to do max hangs. And I would talk to so many people that were doing that had sore fingers all the time. And and that doesn't mean they can't strength train their fingers. It just means that they need to be educated more about, don't be too invested or strict with this is the edge to use, because that's definitely not the case when it comes to the physiology. So it's just understanding more variation and then helping people understand how they can apply it.
Am I right where a really simple analogy of this different lengths leading to different benefits or weaknesses is like if I thought about a pitcher that my hunch is that most baseball pitchers have long arms. Like if they have really short arms, then they can't, they won't throw as fast. Is that like a reasonable analogy there?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I don't really know. I don't know if I've read research papers on pitchers. I should ask Lee. I have is a coach. So heads up, shout out to Lee Fiocchi if he's listening. He's not a rock climber. He's an MLB pitching coach in Florida. And so he's consulted with me for a few pitchers with elbow pain. And his like idea was pitchers should probably train their forearms and their hand because they don't do much preventive stuff in the pitching world, but they get lots of medial elbow pain. And so I'll have to ask him and reach out. I would assume the same though. You would get more of a whip with longer arms for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, because they always demonstrate extreme external rotation to give them that longer movement arm, in their throwing.
Oh, 100%. And the
Yeah.
risk there is quite large, and
Yeah.
the Tommy John surgery and the injuries there is without question, probably the most money has been thrown at that as a researched like prevention thing is for Tommy John surgery because it's so damn common.
Nice little double entendre there thrown at pitchers. Yeah, and then my guess is that someone who's adept or adapted to pitching, probably they wouldn't be able to overhead press a ton of weight. They have these super long arms to whip the ball out versus like slowly press through that range of motion, where a shorter arm, just like you said, you're really good at one arms with having, shorter levers there. And so the reason why I'm picking on this is it's just, I, I guess it's obvious now that we say that fingers will be set up differently like that. But for some reason, because the fingers are small and like, I don't know, you don't think of it that just like some people may have a predisposition to be able to whip a ball better than others, different people may have the ability to be really strong in a contracted static position. And some people may be able to, exert power really quickly on the hold. And I just, so you can see that on an ultrasound, you could ultrasound someone and predict accurately where they might excel or not be so good.
Yeah, usually, especially if we do testing for sure. Like if you test someone's fingers, you test their rate of force development, you do measurements, it's pretty easy to predict what they're good at,
Wow. Can you
you
do
know,
that to
and
my kids and we can find out if they're going to be Olympians or not?
if they're going to be crushers. So the other thing that's interesting with the overload maybe concept is most of the science now shows that athletes that are, and there's a few exceptions, but most like major league best of the best pitchers are not pitchers as kids as well too, because when it comes to, your body has a finite amount of mechanical load you can put through it until things start to break down. And so normally now it's like people that end up in the major leagues pitching, they're not kids that are pitching, because kids that pitch and they only pitch, they throw so many pitches that their elbows are trashed, right? And they get the Tommy John surgery in high school or in early college, and those athletes are not pitchers. And so that kind of like, not to say, I don't know that we have that evidence for climbing in any way, but like it definitely means that there's a finite amount of things that your body can tolerate, right? And so if, and this kind of goes back to climbing in a way of, if we're pushing ourselves on the climbing wall and we're constantly trying hard, limit bouldering, red point bouldering, projecting outside, like there maybe is a reason to step back and say, do I need to overly stress my fingers with a bunch of extra weight on a 20 millimeter edge? And my answer would be like, no, I don't think there's good justification for doing that given both the physiologic adaptation, but also just the sheer volume of stress that we put on our bodies.
Well, what we're also saying is that there is this ceiling and this risk to pushing hard and harder and getting those extra few percent. But in something like pitching, it's a very narrow sport. I don't know. Please don't yell at me, people listening who play MLB, but just the act of pitching is throwing the same ball over and over again. Maybe there's subtle differences, but they just want to emphasize that extreme that they can do and maybe are even genetically predisposed to it. Where in climbing, we're talking about a million variables. And so what I hear you saying too is that even if you're predisposed to having stronger fingers and like a certain grip, you don't want to just hammer it again and again and again for your whole life trying to get like a 1% better, because that's not going to translate to being a top climber.
Yeah, and the risk might be too great, and
Yeah.
then the other thing with like, pitching, and like there's so many different variations of how they hold the ball and twist the ball. And so it's like that variation also adds to the, not only like the linear force, but all the shearing force at the attachment of the bone and stretching the nerve. But when it comes to climbing, like the middle fingers are injured the most. The ring finger, in terms of the pulleys, injured the most. The middle finger, the PIP joints, injured the most. And so the other downside of having a flat edge is it just overloads the middle two fingers. Where the kind of the justification for considering using an unlevel edge is it like takes the load a little bit off the middle two fingers. It'll still load them, of course, but not very often do people get a lot of half crimp stress to the pinky unless they're full crimping. And then you'll talk to those people, and there's I talk to a lot of people with pinky ruptures, pulley ruptures, because the pinky kind of lacks in its capacity, as does the other two fingers. But then the middle two fingers get the majority of the load.
Man, I got to order an unlevel edge instantly, and it just
Oh, someone will send you one. I'll get you one.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we can
I'd
get
be
you one.
psyched. Well, it's just it's also something. I think you did some diagrams on this where this just like you showed the grasping motion, how we're not symmetrical. I think that it's so tempting to think like, oh, we just need to hang on flat edges, like that's the most basic thing. But you showed that that's not really how our hands are built. Like that an unlevel edge is actually fundamentally just more. I mean, it's more anatomical. And so if you're working on strength, like why not make it comfortable? Why make it tweaky and stress one joint more than the other when that's not the goal when we're off the wall?
Yeah, for me, for strength training purposes, that doesn't make sense. In some cases, for capacity building purposes, that also we can say doesn't make as much sense because there's more repetitions, and that's if we're doing stuff off the wall. But like I always think about things from like an evolutionary standpoint. It's like my undergrad is in cultural anthropology, and so like our hand has evolved to grab onto circular objects that don't have a fixed depth to them, right? So having the fingers be different lengths makes really good sense for being coordinated at the fingers, but we didn't really run into trouble because we were always in an open position where But now as climbers, we try and fix them on a small hold, which we need to do for our sport, but there's a limit to like how much we can tolerate of that.
Did you know why this message is so important for people to hear is that when I compare the 20 mil edge on say like a tension board versus the Beastmaker edge, which I think is like 22 or 23 or something, the Beastmaker middle edge is super comfy for me. Like it feels comfortable, and I can one arm hang on that much longer than doing a one arm hang on the 20 mil on the tension board. And like honestly, tension board just doesn't feel that great. And so I'm probably unsupported. And it's just so tempting to compare yourself to others and say, like, oh, like I'm weak on this and I need to double down on it versus, recognizing that there could be an anatomical difference. And if it feels tweaky and not so great, and I just hammer it again and again and again, like, what am I get? Like,
You're gonna
yeah,
lose.
I'm gonna
You're
lose. Yeah.
you're gonna lose. You're not gonna beat your mechanics if you push it too hard. And so one of the other things that I did maybe years ago now when I was kind of like exploring these ideas is I would have my athletes test on a 15 mil, a 20 mil, and a 25 mil all in the same way to just measure the force. And most climbers, most of the people that would come test with me have a good training experience, so they're not like new to finger training, could produce the same amount of force on all three edges. So if you could produce the same force on a 15 or a 25, why the hell would you use a 15 for your finger strength training? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, if it's a off the wall training tool, you want to use the tool that provides a lot of force, of course, but one that's like going to be the most supportive to the joints, because the point is not to stress the joints. The point is to stress the muscle and the ligaments, which you'll still do like on a 25 mil.
And if you wanted to quote unquote stress a position to cause adaptations rather than just strength gains, well, then we can put you on a 10 mil, not necessarily for max effort strength work, but for just getting used to that position, getting the adaptations in the tissue, rather than saying, and this is making you strong. And it's something I did. You said something about people grabbing onto a small crimp for 15 to 30 seconds to maybe kind of get a touch more mobility for that session or something. And that's actually a way that I tackled some of my stress on really small crimps is I just put time into the fingerboard at lower intensity on really small edges with more of the goal of like working up to 15 or 30 seconds. Not really like, and it's really, really hard for me. It's more just kind of getting used to that and letting my body slow. It took me months just to kind of
Yeah.
get used to it. And yeah, it's important that you can separate those concepts.
And I think on the whole, that is like okay and a good idea. But athletes need to hear as well that if you're going to do that and use a fingerboard for that reason, that's fine. Just make sure you account for all the other climbing stuff you're doing too. Because if you try and do the same amount of climbing stuff, which is your normal week, and then you add in a couple sessions where you're doing that, you're adding in a stress that's kind of hard to understand your recovery from. And the joints people will get away with stuff for a month of like, I talk to a lot of people that will like do training practices that aren't bad. They just like do them for a month and they're going really hard for a trip and then they get hurt at the end. And that really is not the day before, the hour before. It really is the slow build of accumulated stress, which is so hard to understand for athletes. And so if you're going to do that, you have to take away some of the other stress to make sure you're being intentional, but it can't just be add more stuff on top, because that's always the biggest risk.
Yeah, this is this whole periodization and not trying to be in tip top form year round. And I just honestly, man, I just really struggle with that concept. Like when I start pushing it, I just want to push it more and more. And how many times do you see people go on a great trip? Like absolutely, they trained up to it. They go on a trip, they climb really well, and then they come back and they just hurt themselves because they're just trying to go and go even harder. And you're like, whoa, take it easy. But it's just hard mentally. I mean, I'm sure you feel this too, man. Like just when you're psyched and you're pushing, you want to be in tip top shape. You're right. I feel like climbing you can say it has seasons, but like if I have a great season outside and then it gets hotter, but I'm in the gym, I still want to like crush in the gym. Do you know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah,
Like
for
I
sure.
don't want to let
It's hard
go.
to back off. It's hard to back
Yeah.
off, but it's totally reasonable and more sustainable to every let's say quarter, you take a couple weeks off and you don't load your fingers and you don't climb. It's really hard to do. Like for people like you and myself, like you have family and kids, it's easier to not load as much because you just don't have as much time. But for a lot of people that, maybe have a partner, they're not married and they're just, the climbing thing is what they do, it's really hard for those athletes to like back off. And so the real message there is, if you don't want to take weeks off every quarter, you got to space your average sessions apart, because almost every single person that I talk to, I'm sure there's always exceptions, but I would say most are in the best shape of their life when they get a finger injury. And if we really stop and think about, well, why the hell do we get hurt when we're in the best shape of our life? It's that you had to put in the work to get in the best shape of your life. And so the accumulated stress, at some point, there's a tipping point, and they just hit that tipping point. And then as a consequence of that, the most important thing for me to do is educate people why it happened, not really, think that there's like special things they need to do to not have it happen again, because that takes people down the road of, I'm going to do this thing forever and I'm not going to get hurt, right? Because everyone wants to have bulletproof fingers. But honestly, the only way you can have bulletproof things and not get hurt is just to don't try hard. Just stop trying hard and you really won't get hurt. But most athletes are not going to do that, right? Climbers are very good at trying hard and they're very good at putting in the work, and so teaching them when not to do that is like a really hard thing, but important.
I always tell people that if they really want to get good at climbing, they have to really try hard. Like it's one of the things you see the most in all climbers, and it often does lead to injury. But the best know how to try seriously hard, and
Yep,
it's
and
dangerous.
they're willing to take that risk for sure. It's like
Yeah,
it's always risky to climb at your limit, and there's nothing you're going to do that's going to really avoid that risk other than not try hard.
I do this old man thing now that's hilarious. Where when I see my friends, and sometimes they've been people on the podcast and they're just on one. You can just, they're out there like doing something super incredible. I often will text message them and be like, "Oh my God, like that was so incredible that you sent that. You are just crushing. Why don't you take a week off?" Like, just
That's
be
funny.
careful. All right, Tyler, geez, man, we went into everything. Actually, is there anything that we didn't cover that I should have asked you before we move on to kind of the outro?
No, not really. I think maybe one thing I thought of just now when you mentioned that is, I used to think about this with skiing, and like I live in a place where the skiing is arguably the best in the world, definitely, some of the best ever. And when I was in college, I would go backcountry skiing with my friends 4 days a week. And we would do laps at Alta. We would go into the slack country and do Patsy Marley, just like the best skiing you can possibly do, right? And at some point, like I'm sitting there and I'm like, when am I ever going to be satisfied? Like, am I ever going to be satisfied? Can you do enough skiing? Can you catch enough perfect waves? Can you do enough problems? Like, at some point, we have to learn that, like, I'm satisfied with my performance. Let's say I worked up to this project and I sent this project. I think it's important for people to understand that being satisfied and then saying, I'm going to take a few weeks and not climb as much, like, is a really sustainable thing. And it's okay to, like, be satisfied with your performance and your hard work, and to stop and reflect on that and actually be okay with taking some time off. Taking time off is not going to reduce your performance. Taking time off is only going to increase your ability to come back more healthy, stronger, like more excited to do another project. But once we get to the point where you just like send a project and you're just like, I'm just going to lean in and keep going, that's when people get injured. So at some point we have to learn to be satisfied, where when I was skiing, I would do like 3 good laps and leave, be like, no, I'm cool. My friends would hang out. I'm like, I'm done. Like it doesn't really help me to do more things, because I have to recover from those things. And at the same time, I was climbing and working and going to college. And it's like, I don't need more things to recover from. I need to be satisfied.
Dude, good wisdom there. It also reminded me of one thing that we kind of touched on, but I just want to make sure that we close the loop on, is this idea of coordination and fatigue, and how when you're climbing well and doing well and trying hard and doing peak efforts, that you need to watch out for fatigue. Or actually, let me not say it What's the connection between coordination and fatigue?
So this is one that's actually hard to teach clients that have been climbing a long time, and you think about like your average board session. Like you have sessions that are like most of them are average. Some of them are ridiculously good. Some of them are ridiculously bad, but most of them are average. And so essentially what that means is like the sport good enough and you're coordinated enough at the sport that subtle fatigue and subtle coordination power losses are hard to detect. So essentially what that means is you want to go into every session as recovered as you can, and then you want to make sure, especially with indoor training sessions, you want the intention to be on the practice, and the intention requires you not always to have like high power, but it requires you to have like precision, the timing, the coordination, the body position, the amount of stuff you do at some point, especially on a board, that's going to drop, and you're going to like, okay, I can't do that hard move again. Let's maybe try a different problem. All that problem, I'm not feeling coordinated. That's when the indoor sessions on average should probably stop. But it's hard for people to detect that know the sport well, because we're used to having those average sessions where if you expose yourself to a new sport, it's super obvious when you're tired. Like I on the side, I like to play the guitar, so I like to play metal guitar, which is like really fast down picking. And so lately that I've been sport climbing, like I've been taking 2 days off after my sport climbing sessions, and it's really obvious when I go play the guitar that my coordination and my timing is not the same. Like I'm definitely tired, right? And so people need to pay attention to that stuff and really, on average, try not to stick around and climb a bunch when you're tired, because the timing is off. Like the technical skills practice is different. You're not getting the same learning that you would if you were fresh.
What's hard for me to square this with is this tip from Dave McLeod in his book 9 out of 10 climbers make the same mistakes or something like that, where he says that pro climbers try their project one more time than you do. And it's something I'm kind of infamous for in my friend group is I get close on a climb, maybe the sun's going down, I am exhausted, and then I just pull it out through sheer will at the very end. And I think that the way I square this in my head is that, well, I wanted to, I was there on my trip doing my one climb. I wasn't training. I was just throwing everything against the wall with a Hail Mary to make it happen. And that's where like I get into that mode in the gym too, where I'm like, no, I'm going to send this boulder. No, I know I'm tired, but I'm going to like pull it out, pull it off that last try. But then that has a risk involved too. And it's maybe not the best way to actually make gains. So just kind of how I think about
I
it.
think I think outside that makes total sense. And I tell most climbers that maybe even they get a finger injury on a trip and they're really close to sending a project, a lot of times they'll say, obviously it's injured injury, but the ability to tolerate risk, or that is up to the person. But if it was me, I would probably take my finger and try hard, and for a lot of the injuries that happen to the fingers. But again, it's like if you flew across the country to go on a vacation, right? And you're on a trip and you're trying hard at the end and you're fatigued. And so that's where the nuance is really important, because that doesn't mean don't ever climb when you're fatigued. It just means that your average gym session, is it worth, after you're 2 hours into a moonboard session, to throw yourself at the 2 finger pocket when your feet cut? After that, I would say on average, that's probably not worth the risk. Most people are better to walk away from that session. So it's not that people can't climb when they're tired. It's really just that always thinking that the effort and the perception of effort is a good indicator of like what's happening underneath the skin has some risk to it.
Well, it's that same concept of what you went to earlier, where you want to get stronger fingers, but at some point, pushing it more and more and more is just adding more and more risk for less gain. And so, if you're in the gym doing a training session, just be careful pushing it more and more. So, dude, Tyler, this was really fun. This was incredible. I meant to ask you in the beginning this question I ask everyone. So I'm sorry, but we're pulling it to the end. Tyler, you've been around tons of incredible climbers. You've seen the best of the best do their thing. What do you think it takes for someone to go from good to great?
I think probably the thing that maybe they're the best at that is still hard for them, but maybe they don't talk about or share, is like being able to take criticism and fail and still like not quit. Right? It's easy to go out to a boulder and get shut down, or to a route and get shut down, but people that have like a really good determination and like professional level determination, that will just push them harder to like lean in more to actually do that thing. And so I think that's probably something that happens to the average climber, is they go to the gym and they expect to climb a thing, and then they fall and fail, and then they're just like, oh, I can't do that thing. Like my friend that I climb with regularly does that, and I'm like, no, we're gonna do this thing. I kind of make him stick around and do it, and then he ends up doing it. And it's like, see, that really wasn't that you couldn't do it. You really just let that initial experience of failing kind of self-talk you into thinking you can't do it. I think that's probably, one of the maybe less talked about things that they have going on for them.
Damn, that's great advice, man. I think we hit a bunch of these, but did we already hit your pro tip during the show, or do you have an additional one you want to throw in there?
I think it was, that there isn't like a protocol that's better than the other necessarily. And so that applies for all sorts of things, like when people take courses of mine online or in person, or the certification course, it's all principle based. So it's all about teaching people exercise science and anatomy and physiology. And so they understand like how the body responds to things and the types of adaptations we expect to happen, which are the specific things. And then because there's a whole bunch of methods that people have used and will use that will increase performance. And so it's really more about, don't fall into the idea that there's a certain thing that you have to do that's going to give you this adaptation. The one thing we can say that you have to do is you have to practice your sport, obviously, but there's a whole bunch of ways you can do that too. But when it comes to training things, there's not a particular way you have to do it. And so don't fall into the trap of thinking, that there's only one way to do things.
Good stuff, man. Tyler, Camp 4 Human Performance. Your is your Instagram handle C4HP? Is that right?
Yes.
Same for your YouTube. Also, I love your YouTube. You haven't put out a ton of videos on there, but they're very clear and to the point. Go. I don't know if they went even deeper than we went today. I think you touched quite a few stuff today, but I highly recommend people check that out. Do you think that all the younger people even know why it's Camp 4? Do you think people even understand that these days?
I think most people probably do. Maybe not youth climbers. I'm not sure. I think that's still enough of a like, I guess, name in the climbing world that they probably do. And that really came from when I was in college. We would go there for the summers and climb big walls, and I was mostly into trad climbing and just kind of thought of it as like a base or a place where people could go and get multiple things, right? Not just like training things. But my business has changed a lot over the years, where my initial clinic, I don't really see many. I mean, most of my clients are climbers, almost all of them, and I mostly just help manage and educate people about shoulder, elbow, and finger injuries. And certainly have lots of experience treating other joints, but I don't do as much like spinal injury things anymore as my clinic when it first came out. So
Well, Camp 4 holds a special place in my heart too. It's the camp in Yosemite by all those big walls, by El Cap, and also Midnight Lightning is right there. So good stuff. Here's my business idea for you, Tyler. Is I want to go and get ultrasound and measured by you, and then get unlevel edge specifically for me, so that it loads me evenly and safely. So that's my there's my
there's actually one of the companies that makes those that will not use an ultrasound, but they'll use a hand measurement to actually make one that fits your hand a little better. And I think
wow,
most people that I've heard from say that that one feels the best on their hand. So I'll put you in touch with Zach and
awesome.
have him make you one. He'll be psyched to make you one for sure. And you can just like, shout him out at some point and he'll be psyched.
That's really cool, and I'm convinced after talking to you that I want to be comfortable and safe when I'm doing that strength training part, and then let those tweaky holds outdoors do their thing in their way, and not try to confuse the two. So yeah, thanks, Tyler. Anywhere else we can point people that are interested in hearing more from you?
Most of my, I would say, content now, I've gone back and forth over the last year, but is Instagram. That's kind of my home base, let's say, for social things. And so in my profile are access to my website, where on the website there's a lot of blog posts and articles I've written, and the YouTube video stuff is there, and then also education like courses. There's a lot of online courses I have there, and then certification stuff. So that's probably the best way to get to the website is through Instagram.
And they can come see if they're in Salt Lake City, right?
Yeah, in my office here, it's mostly mostly education. Like for my job as someone that helps manage injuries is education and programming. So I don't really do any like passive physical therapy interventions anymore. It's mostly just like talking to people about their life and their loading and their diet and their goals, and then developing rehab training programs for them to do on their own, which I think from my experience works as good or better than doing a lot of passive interventions, just because it's more about empowering them to help themselves, which works very well. And so yeah, so if they're in Salt Lake, they can find me downtown as well.
Well, thanks, man. And I appreciate all the content you put out. I also appreciate you just kind of asking some of the harder questions about the training that we've kind of taken for granted in the past, and doing the ultrasounding and looking at morphology. I feel like you're a bit more on the cutting edge of just kind of asking why we've done things the way we do them before, if there's a way to do it better. And then the whole explanation you went through about really separating what finger training is good for when it comes to climbing, and that kind of intermediate step, as I kind of suggested, was really helpful for me, just grokking how it should fit into my climbing life. So thanks, dude. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the support as well. It's in some cases fun to be at the cutting edge, in other cases it's not. It's not. It's the pushback is good too, but yeah, I appreciate it.
If you weren't getting any pushback, what are you even doing? It's you know, you gotta have some unhappiness. Otherwise, you're just towing the line, and that's not how things move forward.
Yeah, that's definitely been something that I never have been good at doing ever since I was a kid.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad we got to hash it out and go deep. And I can't wait to see and hear what you do next. And I'm sure we'll catch up in a year or so on all the new discoveries you've had.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it, man.
All right. Take care. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like even more content, go to patreon.com/testpiece. And while you're at it, share this podcast with someone you know who would love it. And please leave us a review or rating at wherever you get your podcasts. We've also got tons of great content on YouTube and Instagram, so don't forget to like and subscribe there. Okay, see you next week.